Big Shaq was minding his own business when a smug billionaire clinked his glass and sneered, "Let's welcome the athlete who thinks he's a businessman." Hope he brought a calculator. The room erupted in laughter. Champagne glasses clinked. Cameras rolled. But instead of getting angry, Shaq just smiled. Because he had already won. What happened next humiliated the billionaire, crushed his empire, and left the entire business world in shock. Stay till the end, because this story will leave you speechless. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The laughter is quiet at first. Then it spreads, a ripple through the room, growing louder as glasses clink and smug grins widen. A joke at Shaquille O'Neal's expense, passed around like a fine bottle of whiskey. But Shaq isn't laughing, not yet. The grand ballroom of the Astoria Hotel glows under a golden chandelier, dripping in wealth and exclusivity. CEOs, hedge fund managers, and billionaire investors swirl their champagne, engaged in hushed conversations about market trends and million-dollar deals. The scent of aged scotch and expensive cigars lingers in the air. Then the atmosphere shifts. A towering figure steps through the entrance, Shaquille O'Neal. Dressed in a custom-tailored navy suit, his presence alone commands attention. He moves through the crowd with ease, shaking hands, exchanging nods, his deep baritone voice carrying weight. But despite his effortless confidence, eyes linger a little too long, whispers pass between manicured lips. He's not just an athlete here, he's an anomaly. Enter William Sterling IV, old money, a legacy billionaire whose family's wealth stretches back generations. With slicked-back blonde hair and a self-satisfied smirk, he watches Shaq like a predator sizing up its prey. Sterling taps his crystal glass with a silver spoon, the chime slicing through the hum of conversation. The room quiets. He steps forward, eyes gleaming with the anticipation of a well-timed insult. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announces, raising his voice just enough for dramatic effect, "let's welcome a sports legend." Hope he brought a calculator. Laughter erupts. Polished businessmen and socialites chuckle, some covering their mouths, others openly entertained. Shaq's face remains unreadable. He merely lifts an eyebrow, his fingers tapping lightly against his glass. Sterling's grin widens. He's enjoying this. "Tell me, Shaq," he continues, swirling his drink, "do you even read financial reports, or just dunk on them?" Another wave of laughter. A few hesitant chuckles from those who sense the weight of the moment, but don't dare defy Sterling's influence. Shaq doesn't flinch. He doesn't shift in discomfort or fire back with immediate retaliation. Instead, he takes a slow, deliberate sip of his drink, letting the tension build, letting Sterling bask in his supposed victory. The silence stretches just long enough to make the room uneasy. Then finally Shaq smiles, but it's not friendly. It's the kind of smile a lion gives before it pounces. "That's funny," he says, voice smooth as silk. He sets his drink down with a quiet clink, his gaze locking onto Sterling's. "But let's see if you're still laughing by the end of the night." The laughter dies instantly. The room stiffens. Sterling's smirk falters, just for a second, but Shaq sees it. Game on. The room hasn't fully recovered from Shaq's last words, but Sterling? He's not backing down. If anything, he's doubling down. He leans back in his chair, an arrogant smirk plastered across his face, swirling the last drops of his whiskey. The glow of the chandelier casts sharp angles on his features, his confidence unwavering. "You know, I gotta admire your courage, Shaq," Sterling says, voice dripping with condescension. "Walking into a room like this, thinking you belong." A few chuckles ripple through the crowd. Some are genuine, others hesitant. Nobody wants to be the one to cross William Sterling IV. Shaq doesn't react. Not yet. Sterling's smirk widens. He leans forward, setting his empty glass down with an unnecessary clink. "Athletes blow their money fast. Guess you're here for a loan?" Laughter erupts again, louder this time. Sterling revels in it. His words are designed to wound, to remind Shaq that no matter how much money he's made, in the eyes of men like him, he'll always be just an athlete. Shaq stays silent. But those who know him best notice something. His fingers, tapping lightly against the table. It's a tell. Not of frustration, not of anger, of calculation. He's not reacting emotionally. He's processing. His team, seated nearby, exchanges subtle glances. They've seen this before. They know what's coming. Sterling, oblivious, keeps pushing. I mean, let's be real. You made a fortune, sure. But how much of that is left? Fancy suits don't pay for themselves, big guy. Another wave of laughter. More glasses raised. More nods of agreement. The assumption is clear. Sterling is right. Shaq exhales slowly, still tapping, still calculating. Then he finally speaks. You got a lot of confidence, he says, his voice smooth as silk. He leans forward slightly, his massive frame making Sterling look smaller. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't need to. I wonder if you have the bank balance to back it up. The laughter stops. Sterling's smirk falters, just for a second, but Shaq catches it. The shift is subtle, but the room feels it. The energy has changed. Shaq is done playing defense. It's his turn now. Sterling's smirk lingers, but there's an unease behind it now, an imperceptible shift in confidence. The room is quieter, the air thicker, a tension no one dares to acknowledge. Shaq leans back in his chair, adjusting the cuff of his suit. His expression is unreadable, but his presence alone commands attention. The tapping of his fingers has stopped. His calculations are complete. You talk a lot about money, Shaq says, his voice steady. So let's talk about mine. A flicker of confusion flashes across Sterling's face, but he quickly masks it with amusement. Shaq continues, his tone almost casual. You see, I don't just play basketball. I invest, own franchises, build businesses. I don't just cash checks, Sterling. I sign them. A murmur ripples through the crowd. Sterling chuckles, but it's forced. What? You mean your pizza shops? Cute. Owning a few fast food joints doesn't make you a businessman. Shaq finally smiles. A slow, knowing smile. The kind that says, you just walked into a trap. He reaches into his pocket, pulls out his phone, and taps a few times before turning the screen toward Sterling. You're right, he says smoothly. Owning a failing hedge fund does. The color drains from Sterling's face. His smile flickers, just for a second, but long enough for Shaq to catch it, long enough for the entire room to see it. A sharp inhale comes from somewhere in the crowd. People shift uncomfortably. This is no longer entertainment. This is something else. Sterling sits up straighter, trying to recover. What the hell are you talking about? He scoffs, reaching for his drink, but his fingers are tight around the glass now. Shaq doesn't answer immediately. He lets the moment stretch. Lets Sterling feel the weight of it. Then finally, I own a stake in Summit Equity Partners. The reaction is immediate. Gasps, low murmurs, eyes darting towards Sterling, waiting for his response. Summit Equity Partners, Sterling's firm. The very one whispered about in business circles, rumored to be struggling behind closed doors. Sterling lets out a dry laugh. So what? A minority stake doesn't mean anything. Shaq tilts his head, feigning curiosity. Doesn't it? Because according to this, he turns the screen back to himself, scrolling casually. Investors are starting to pull out. Wonder why. Sterling's grip on his glass tightens. His jaw clenches. He wasn't expecting this. The crowd waits, eager, silent, watching the shift. Shaq lifts his glass, his voice smooth as ever. But hey, you're the financial expert. I'm just an athlete, right? Silence. Sterling doesn't have an answer. Not yet. The energy in the room had shifted, and Sterling knew it. The laughter that once echoed so freely now felt distant, almost forced. A few businessmen stole uneasy glances at one another, sensing that something had changed. Shaq, on the other hand, remained composed, his expression unreadable as he placed his drink back on the table with quiet precision. Sterling, still grasping onto the confidence he had wielded so effortlessly all evening, let out a dry chuckle, though there was something unnatural about it. His fingers drummed lightly against the rim of his glass, a subtle tell that only the most observant would catch. You really think a minority stake in my firm gives you any real insight, he said, tilting his head as if amused. Summit Equity Partners is worth billions. A few rough months are nothing in the grand scheme of things. Shaq didn't respond right away. Instead, he let the weight of the conversation settle over the table, allowing every individual present to marinate in the growing tension. He had spent years in high-pressure situations, from championship games to boardroom negotiations, and if there was one thing he understood, it was patience. His deep brown eyes remained locked on Sterling, watching, analyzing, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Finally, he exhaled and straightened in his chair, his voice steady yet carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. That's the thing, he said. his words deliberate. It's not just a few rough months, is it? There was no laughter now, no murmurs of agreement. The men who had once been so quick to align themselves with Sterling sat still, their postures subtly more rigid, their expressions unreadable. Sterling forced a smirk, but it lacked the effortless charm he had displayed earlier. I don't know what you're trying to imply, he said, though the slight strain in his voice betrayed his unease. Shaq reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and tapped the screen a few times before turning it toward the table. The screen illuminated a simple but damning image, a financial graph, its bright red line plummeting at an alarming rate. Several pairs of eyes widened. Someone shifted in their chair, while another discreetly pulled out their own phone, perhaps to verify the information for themselves. A low murmur passed through a group of executives seated near the back. Shaq let the display linger for a moment before speaking again. I did some reading, he said smoothly, his tone casual, almost conversational. And it looks like your investors have been pulling out. Not just a few either. A lot. Sterling's expression darkened. His grip on his glass tightened ever so slightly, the movement small but telling. The man who had once held the room in the palm of his hand was suddenly fighting to keep control. A few feet away, a middle-aged man with silver-rimmed glasses, a hedge fund manager Shaq recognized from past meetings, exchanged an uneasy glance with his associate. Another cleared his throat and averted his gaze. Sterling, sensing the shift in power, attempted to recover. He leaned back in his chair and forced out a laugh, though it lacked the genuine confidence he had carried earlier. Investors come and go, he said dismissively. Markets fluctuate. This isn't some grand revelation. Shaq studied him for a long moment before allowing a slow, knowing smile to cross his face. He didn't need to raise his voice or make a grand spectacle of it. The truth had already begun unraveling, and Sterling was the only one pretending not to see it. Looks like I'm better at math than you thought, Shaq said smoothly, lifting his glass once more. Sterling didn't respond. His jaw tightened, his gaze flickering between Shaq and the businessmen around him, as if calculating just how much damage had already been done. The cracks were beginning to show, and everyone in the room could see them now. For the first time that evening, Sterling wasn't in control. The room that had once hung on to his every word was now watching him with wary curiosity. The weight of Shaq's revelation pressed down on him, squeezing the air from the space he had once dominated. But men like William Sterling IV didn't fold easily. His fingers tightened around his glass before he forced himself to relax, leaning back in his chair with an easy smirk. He let out a sharp, practiced laugh, the kind meant to brush off any suggestion that he was rattled. Oh, come on, he said, his voice taking on a faux casual tone. Numbers go up and down. That's the nature of the game. He waved a dismissive hand as if brushing away Shaq's revelation like an annoying gnat. But class? He paused, taking a leisurely sip of his drink before setting it down. Now that's permanent. Some of the men around the table chuckled nervously, eager to align themselves with whichever side seemed strongest. Sterling saw his opening. He straightened in his chair, his smirk sharpening into something cruel. You know, Shaq, he continued, I have to admit, I almost bought into the act. The suits, the investments, the business talk, it's impressive, really. He clasped his hands together, tilting his head as though studying an interesting experiment. But tell me, did you even graduate? The words landed like a slap. The room tensed. A few guests glanced at each other, uncertain of how to react. Some lowered their gazes, unwilling to be caught in the crossfire. Others smirked, amused that Sterling was attempting to reclaim his position. Shaq, however, didn't react the way Sterling expected. There was no flicker of embarrassment, no quick retort, just silence. Then after a long, drawn-out pause, Shaq chuckled. Not a forced laugh, not a nervous one. A deep, genuine, from-the-chest kind of laugh. The kind that made people shift in their seats because it meant something was coming. Sterling's smirk faltered for the briefest moment before he forced it back into place. Glad you find that funny, he muttered. But there was an edge to his voice now, a hint of something unsure. Shaq reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen a few times, then turned it towards Sterling, his expression unreadable. I think you'll want to see this, he said smoothly. Sterling's smirk vanished. The room leaned in. The game wasn't over yet. A heavy silence filled the room, stretching longer than Sterling had anticipated. Moments ago, he had been in complete control, steering the conversation with sharp jabs and condescending remarks. Now, however, the weight of anticipation had shifted entirely. The air felt different, thicker, charged with something unspoken yet undeniable. All eyes were on Shaq as he calmly held up his phone, his expression unreadable. Without a word, he swiped up on the screen, revealing a document that gleamed under the golden glow of the grand chandelier. The polished surface of the phone reflected the faces of the onlookers, their curiosity now sharpened into something else entirely. The bold lettering at the top of the certificate was unmistakable, and as recognition dawned upon the audience, the quiet murmurs of skepticism turned into stunned silence. It was not just any degree, it was a doctorate in education, an earned PhD, not an honorary title granted for celebrity status, but a result of real academic effort and dedication. The impact of the revelation rippled through the crowd like a slow-moving wave. The businessmen who had laughed at Sterling's earlier remarks sat rigid in their seats, their amusement now long forgotten. A few notable Harvard alumni exchanged glances, nodding in acknowledgement of the achievement. Even those who had initially dismissed Shaq as just another athlete now found themselves reconsidering their assumptions. Shaq's voice, deep and measured, broke the silence. "You asked if I graduated," he said, holding the phone steady so that everyone could see the proof in front of them. His tone was calm, devoid of arrogance, yet it carried the weight of a man who had been underestimated too many times. "I didn't just graduate, I earned this." Sterling's face shifted through a range of expressions. First confusion, then mild disbelief, and finally something bordering on unease. His lips parted as though he wanted to say something, but for the first time that evening, words failed him. He blinked rapidly, glancing at the phone and then back at Shaq, his usual bravado momentarily stripped away. You, you actually," Sterling stammered, his voice quieter now, the cocky edge gone. Shaq didn't rush his response. He set his phone down gently on the table, laced his fingers together and leaned forward just enough to make his presence impossible to ignore. His smile was slow, deliberate, not one of mockery but of quiet satisfaction. He had no need to gloat. The facts spoke for themselves. "Yeah," he said, his voice steady, his eyes locked onto Sterling's. He let the words settle before continuing, his tone carrying the kind of weight that only came with absolute certainty. "And now let's talk about your education." A shift occurred in the room, subtle but undeniable. Where moments ago Sterling had been the man in control, the one leading the conversation with confidence and ease, he now found himself sitting under the collective scrutiny of the audience. The shift was palpable. The tables turned in a way that even he hadn't anticipated. For the first time that night, Sterling wasn't just uncomfortable. He was exposed. And the worst part? The conversation had only just begun. For most of the night, Sterling had controlled the room with effortless arrogance, weaving insults into smooth conversation, ensuring that no one questioned his authority. But now the power had shifted. He was no longer the man leading the discussion. He was the one being examined. The weight of 100 skeptical eyes pressed down on him, and for the first time, he felt it. Shaq had just turned the tables, and everyone in the room knew it. Sterling swallowed, forcing a strained chuckle as he adjusted the cuffs of his designer suit. He was trying to regain his composure, but the hesitation in his movements betrayed him. "All right, Shaq," he said, his voice carrying an edge of forced amusement. "You've made your point. You've got a degree. Good for you." He gestured vaguely toward the phone still sitting on the table. "But let's be honest, nobody here actually cares about framed pieces of paper. We care about power, business, legacy." He leaned forward slightly, trying to project control. "And I built mine the old-fashioned way. Not through sports, not through endorsements, but through intelligence." A murmur passed through the room, some nodding, others watching carefully, waiting to see where this would go. Shaq, however, remained unbothered. He didn't rise to the bait, didn't react to the subtle jab about his background. Instead, he exchanged a glance with a man seated a few chairs down, a member of his business team wearing a sleek navy suit. The man gave a barely perceptible nod before tapping on his tablet. A moment later, Shaq turned back to Sterling, his expression unreadable. "You built yours through intelligence?" he asked, his tone light but carrying an unmistakable weight beneath it. He let the question linger for a moment before adding, "That's interesting." Sterling's jaw tightened. He didn't like the way Shaq was looking at him, like he already knew something. Shaq's business associate slid his tablet across the table, positioning it directly in front of Sterling. The glossy screen displayed a document, its contents crisp and undeniable under the ballroom's soft golden lighting. The moment Sterling's eyes landed on it, his entire body went rigid. Shaq's voice was smooth, steady. "Because according to this," he said, tapping the screen, "you never actually graduated." The room, already tense, plunged into absolute silence. A few gasps rippled through the crowd. Several businessmen exchanged startled looks, their expressions shifting from curiosity to something far more serious. Sterling, the man who had paraded himself as the smartest person in the room, the man who had ridiculed Shaq for his education, had never even earned his own degree. His supposed Ivy League education? Fake. Sterling's face turned a shade paler as his gaze darted between the document and Shaq. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. It was as if his brain was scrambling for an explanation, a way to salvage this moment before it spiraled completely out of control. Someone in the crowd finally broke the silence. "Is this real?" a voice murmured. Another businessman, one who had been firmly in Sterling's corner all night, leaned forward, eyes narrowed as he studied the document. His voice carried a dangerous edge when he spoke. "Sterling, what the hell is this?" Sterling's fingers twitched against the table. This is ridiculous," he said sharply, trying to muster the same confidence that had once come so easily. But there was a strain in his voice now, an underlying panic that he couldn't quite hide. Shaq didn't look away. He didn't raise his voice or gloat. He simply watched, letting Sterling stew in the weight of his own unraveling. "Looks like someone's been lying to a lot of people," Shaq mused, his voice still deceptively calm. More murmurs, more whispers. The once friendly crowd was shifting. Sterling's hands curled into fists as he inhaled sharply through his nose. His jaw clenched, and for the first time that night, his voice dropped its casual arrogance, replaced with something more raw. "You think you can ruin me?" he hissed. But he already knew. His reputation had taken a hit. And this was just the beginning. The murmurs in the room had transformed into something sharper, more dangerous. Sterling, who had spent the entire evening holding court like a king among businessmen, now found himself at the center of something far more volatile. The revelation of his fake degree had turned whispers into full-blown conversations, the weight of scrutiny pressing down on him like an unbearable force. And then, someone pulled out a phone. A journalist, seated toward the back of the gala, tapped rapidly on their screen. The glow of the device illuminated their face as they composed a tweet, their expression shifting from curiosity to something closer to exhilaration. Within seconds, the message was out. Breaking. Billionaire CEO William Sterling IV exposed for falsifying Ivy League degree. Story developing. The business scandal. The effect was instant. More phones emerged from pockets and purses. Screens lit up like fireflies in the dimly lit ballroom as guests refreshed their feeds, their faces reflecting the unfolding storm. Some discreetly typed out messages while others openly gawked at Sterling, the man they had once admired or feared, now reduced to a trending topic in real time. Sterling saw it happening. His eyes darted around the room, his breathing tight as he registered the ripple effect. He wasn't just losing respect, he was losing control of the narrative. The realization crashed into him like a wave. His carefully curated reputation, the decades of power his family name had afforded him, were slipping through his fingers with each passing second. Sterling shot up from his chair, his sudden movement causing the glasses on the table to rattle. "This is absurd," he barked, his voice sharper than it had been all evening. "A tweet? That's what you people are reacting to. A damn tweet?" But no one looked convinced. If anything, his frustration only fueled the fire. A well-dressed investor near the center of the table leaned back, adjusting his cufflinks with an air of casual disappointment. "William," he said, his voice smooth but laced with quiet disapproval. "Is it true?" Sterling hesitated, just for a second. That second was all it took. The hesitation, the flicker of uncertainty, was more damning than any outright denial could have been. The investor exhaled through his nose, a slow, measured breath. He didn't press for an answer. He didn't need to. Instead, he simply picked up his phone and typed something out. Moments later, another executive did the same, then another. Sterling felt it slipping further. Damage control. He needed damage control. His mind raced. He straightened his suit, forcing his shoulders back, trying to reclaim some sense of authority. "This is ridiculous," he said, his tone shifting, desperate to regain footing. "Let's not act like any of this is a real problem. What matters is business, numbers, profits. If you think a diploma changes that, Shaq, who had been silent for the past few minutes, finally leaned forward. The movement was subtle, but it commanded attention. His massive frame, his quiet confidence. It made Sterling's rant seem smaller, less significant. When Shaq spoke, his voice was calm, almost amused. This isn't even the worst part. The room stilled. Sterling's mouth, still halfway open from his attempted argument, snapped shut. His fingers twitched at his sides. He could handle rumors, handle scandal, but the way Shaq said it, the way the entire room waited for what was coming next, made his stomach twist. Something worse? The thought alone made his pulse spike. Shaq, still leaning forward, let the moment stretch. And then, he smiled. The night wasn't over yet. Sterling had faced setbacks before. He had handled corporate betrayals, financial losses, even public scrutiny. But this was different. His fake degree had been exposed. The media had latched onto the scandal. And now Shaq was sitting across from him, still composed, still calm, still holding the room in the palm of his hand. But then, Shaq spoke again. "This isn't even the worst part," he had said. And the moment those words left his mouth, Sterling felt something cold settle in his chest. A member of Shaq's business team, the same man who had pulled up the report on Sterling's degree, now slid a second document across the table. This time it wasn't just a single-page certificate, it was a full investigative report. Sterling didn't want to look, but he had to. His eyes scanned the first few lines, his pulse spiking as he took in the damning words staring back at him. Investor fraud, market manipulation, pending regulatory review. His breath hitched. Shaq leaned back in his chair, folding his massive arms across his chest. "Turns out," he said, his tone casual but cutting, "your little hedge fund has been bleeding more than just money." A businessman seated near the edge of the table, a seasoned investor in his 60s, adjusted his glasses and squinted at the report. His face darkened. "Sterling," he said slowly, flipping a page. "Is this saying what I think it's saying?" Sterling swallowed, forcing himself to mask his panic. He could already feel the sweat gathering at the base of his neck. "I don't know what kind of stunt this is," he said, his voice tight. "But anyone with half a brain knows that hedge funds take risks. Some pay off, some don't. That's the market." Shaq's team member didn't even look up. He scrolled further on his tablet, then turned it around for the entire table to see. "It's not just about risks, Mr. Sterling," he said smoothly. "It's about deception, hiding losses, redirecting funds, and targeting small investors, ones who trusted you." Someone cursed under their breath. A woman at the far end of the room whispered something to her associate. Another businessman, one of Sterling's longtime supporters, pushed back his chair and stood. "I need to make a call," he muttered, stepping away. Sterling's pulse pounded. This can't be happening. And then, his phone rang. The screen lit up. The name flashing across it made his stomach drop. His lawyer. He hesitated, but he already knew. He answered. The voice on the other end was low, urgent. "William," his lawyer said, "we have a problem." Sterling gripped his phone tighter than he realized, his knuckles turning white as his lawyer's voice crackled in his ear. The words were sharp, cutting through the noise of the gala like a blade. "William, we have a problem. A big one." The room around him felt like it was shrinking. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat louder than the last. He barely registered the murmurs of the businessmen who had once been his allies, now whispering amongst themselves, glancing at their phones, their expressions shifting from concern to quiet calculation. Sterling forced himself to swallow. What exactly are we dealing with?" he muttered, his voice lower now, his confidence slipping with each passing second. The lawyer sighed, a heavy sound that only made Sterling's stomach twist harder. "The SEC just launched an official investigation into Summit Equity Partners. Someone leaked internal documents, fraudulent transactions, false investor reports. It's all over the news, William. Stockholders are pulling out." Sterling's breath hitched. No, this isn't happening." He turned toward the long banquet table, eyes darting to the men he had done business with for years. But he didn't find support there. Instead, he saw distance, executives deliberately avoiding his gaze, fingers flying over phone screens as they undoubtedly issued sell orders. Then, as if on cue, a notification lit up someone's phone at the table. A stock report. "Summit Equity Partners, Plunges 47% in pre-market trading. Sterling's mouth went dry. A sharp voice belonging to one of his board members cut through the growing chaos. William, we need to talk. Now. He looked up and the sight made his stomach drop. Three of his board members, men who had once toasted champagne with him, who had stood beside him in the best and worst of times, were standing together, their expressions stone cold. His lawyer's voice was still in his ear. They're going to ask you to step down. A cold sweat broke out along the back of his neck. He forced a laugh, but it came out weak, barely a shadow of his usual bravado. Gentlemen, let's not be hasty, he started. But the words felt useless, even as he said them. One of the board members raised a hand, cutting him off. We've already made our decision, he said simply. Sterling's stomach twisted violently. You can resign, another added, or we'll make it official at the next meeting. The weight of those words settled over him like a crushing force. He had built this empire, clawed his way to the top, made himself untouchable, but now in the space of a single night, it was unraveling before his eyes. And then, just beyond them, he saw him, Shaq, still calm, still watching. Sterling felt his chest tighten with something he couldn't quite name. Anger, humiliation, desperation. He had mocked Shaq, belittled him, laughed at him, and now Shaq had taken everything from him without breaking a sweat. His hands clenched at his sides as he slowly turned to face the man who had orchestrated his downfall. His voice, once full of arrogance, now barely a whisper. Why did you do this? Shaq didn't answer immediately. He just smiled, and that smile told Sterling everything. Some people learn the hard way. Some never learn at all. Sterling sat frozen in his chair, his world crumbling around him. His hands, which once held whiskey glasses with effortless charm, now gripped the table's edge, his knuckles pale. The men he had once commanded now whispered amongst themselves, their voices low, their expressions unreadable. His board members had abandoned him. His investors had turned their backs. His company, his empire, was slipping away like sand through his fingers. And across the table, Shaq stood. Slowly, with the measured confidence of a man who had already won, he straightened the lapels of his tailored suit. Every movement deliberate, every second stretching longer than Sterling could bear. Then finally, Shaq looked at him, not with anger, not with mockery, but with something far worse, disappointment. You embarrassed yourself, Shaq said simply. The words landed heavier than any insult, heavier than any humiliation Sterling had ever faced. He flinched but didn't respond. What could he say? What argument was left? Shaq didn't linger for a reaction. He didn't need to. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his towering frame cutting through the stunned silence of the gala. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, the power in the room shifting with every step he took. Sterling remained seated, his mind racing, his vision narrowing to the empty glass in front of him. Just an hour ago, he had been the center of attention. Now he was just another man left behind in someone else's rise. Then, movement. A young businessman, no older than 30, broke away from a group near the bar and approached Shaq. His posture was confident but respectful, his expression full of something Sterling no longer recognized. Admiration. I'd love to work with you, the young man said. Shaq paused, glancing at him, then at the room around them. A slow, knowing smile crossed his face. Smart choice, he replied. Behind them, Sterling sat alone, his empire in ruins. 1 year later, the world had moved on. The name William Sterling IV had all but vanished from business circles, a relic of a past scandal that no one cared to revisit. Once his name had been synonymous with wealth, power, and influence. Now it was nothing more than a footnote, a cautionary tale whispered in hushed tones at corporate gatherings. The company he had built, Summit Equity Partners, no longer bore his mark. The board had swiftly erased every trace of him, distancing themselves from his fraudulent legacy. His penthouse office, which once overlooked the entire city, now belonged to someone else. His seat at the table, once unchallenged, was occupied by a new leader, one with integrity. Meanwhile, Shaq had only risen higher. In the past year, his business empire had expanded beyond expectations. New partnerships, groundbreaking investments, and a growing reputation as one of the most influential businessmen of his generation had cemented his place in the corporate world. No longer was he just an NBA legend. He was a business icon. He sat in the back of a sleek private lounge, the skyline stretching out before him through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city that once belonged to men like Sterling was now his to shape. The low hum of conversation buzzed around him. Executives, young entrepreneurs, visionaries, all eager to learn from the man who had defied expectations. On the glass table in front of him sat a neatly folded magazine. The bold headline caught his eye, standing out against the sharp professional cover design, from NBA star to business icon, how Shaquille O'Neal changed the game. Shaq picked up the magazine, flipping through the pages with quiet amusement. The article chronicled his rise, not just as an athlete, but as a strategist, an investor, a leader. It highlighted the businesses he had built, the industries he had conquered, the empires he had touched. And near the end of the article, a brief mention of William Sterling IV. Not in admiration, not in respect, just a reminder of what happens to men who underestimate those they think are beneath them. Shaq chuckled, shaking his head as he leaned back in his chair. He tapped the magazine lightly against his palm, a slow grin spreading across his face. And they said I wasn't smart. The laughter rumbled deep in his chest, rich with satisfaction. He had played the long game, and he had won.